welcome to the second session of Youth Decide, the Young Civic Leaders Forum, organized by the Rotary Club of Centennial United. We are indeed grateful for your continued and enthusiastic participation with our program, and even at the end of today's session, we hope you gain so much and add so much to your knowledge and use this knowledge in a productive manner in the future. With that being said, before we head along to today's session, a kind request to keep all your mics on mute, videos switched off, and if you have any questions, queries, or any comments, please feel free to use the chat option for that. The topic for today is something that all of us can very easily relate to, and the topic is social media and its role in civic participation. The session will be conducted by Ms. Sheshadri Kottearachchi. Ms. Sheshadri has obtained her Master's in International Affairs and Diplomacy from the University of Oxford, and she also has her academic background in international relations and English literature. Ms. Sheshadri has worked with the humanitarian as well as the non-governmental sector, and has also worked with international non-governmental organizations as well as many grassroots level organizations. Her experience and expertise span across a diversity of fields, which includes communication, social media management, content creation, research, media design, public speaking, and much, much more. She's a volunteer, a trainer, and an activist, and was also the youth diplomat to the United Nations in 2017. So without further ado, I would like to warmly welcome Ms. Sheshadri Kottearachchi and invite her to proceed along with the session.
Thank you so much for such a kind introduction, Lakshita. I really appreciate that. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for being here, and a big thank you to the Rotary Club of Centennial United for having me again. This is the second time I'm joining in with the organization, except this time I will be supporting the Youth Civic Leaders Forum, Youth Decide, which is very exciting because it's an area that I love working in, and it has been something that I have been working in for quite some time. Lakshita did give quite an elaborate description into my background, but just to add a little bit as to why I'll be speaking on social media, because when I was for this session, I very specifically said, rather than talking on simply civic participation, I would like, and how that connects with civic participation. And the reason I say this is because I have worked with youth organizations, several INGOs, on social media campaigns, and there's quite a diverse array of challenges, a lot of insight that you gain when you're part of these social media campaigns, specifically when the campaigns are targeted towards young people. So in case you're wondering why and how I'm speaking on this specifically, that is my background on social media and civic participation. Now, before we begin, I think it's important that we understand that both social media and civic participation cover a broad area of insight, a lot of experience, expertise. There's a lot of information that is part of both social media and civic participation. And if you think about how long social media and civic participation has been around, of the two, social media is a fairly new phenomenon and it's an evolving phenomenon, whereas civic participation has been around for as long as democracies have existed, for as long as central government has been established. So it has a fairly older, a much more deeper historical background. But social media is very, very new and it's constantly evolving. Because of that, and because we have a limited time to spend with each other today, the goal of the discussion is not going to be a particular deep dive, but we're going to focus on the relationship between these two elements, between social media and civic participation. And we're going to ask ourselves, and I hope that you, in the duration of this session, ask yourself on how is it that we engage with social media? Is it worth engaging at all? Should we be involved in it just because everyone else seems to be doing it? And what prospects does social media have in terms of civic participation? So just so you understand on which topics we'll be touching on, this is going to be the scope of the discussion. I'm going to establish a few session rules because civic participation can be a sensitive area. It's an important area, but it can also be one that is subjected to a lot of debate and discussion. So as we go along and as we engage with each other, let's just maintain the fact that there is no political bias in anything that's going to be discussed today. There's no ethnosocial or religious bias. And if you do have any questions or if you have any comments that you'd like to share with me or with the audience today, I request that we all remain respectful to each other. And the main thing is, I want all of you to engage, be it through questions or comments, or you can even send a message on the chat, whatever it may be. The requirement today is for you to engage. So it's not just going to be me talking. Okay, so the first question I would like to ask you is, what does civic engagement mean to you? If I could get a few answers, that would be great. And remember, there's no right or wrong answer. We're all here to learn. We're all here to understand the topic better. So please go ahead. What does civic engagement mean to you?
It's like when you work together in society to fix issues that we face as a society.
Okay, so Didni, okay, hi, thank you so much for answering. So you believe civic engagement to be working together in society to fix a problem? Is that what you're trying to? Okay, great. Does anyone else have any other, like a different perspective to that? So she's speaking on working together to fix a problem. Anybody else? Any other alternate definitions or comments? Okay, so we have engaging in the governance of society, right? And working to make a difference in society. Okay, thank you, both of you all three of you actually, for your responses. So the reason that I ask you what civic engagement means is because it doesn't have a right or wrong answer, and it has multiple definitions, right? So of all of these definitions, I've put together a few which I thought were fairly profound and explain the situation best. So UNICEF published a report a few years ago, I believe it was in 2018, I think, or the cusp of 2019. And for them, engagement, civic participation is quite like you mentioned, individual or collective actions in which people participate to improve the well-being of communities or society in general. So that's a fairly broad spectrum. Essentially, it's getting together to do good. Then we have a more academic definition to civic engagement, which Diller identifies as an individual's duty to embrace the responsibilities of citizenship with the obligation to actively participate alone or in concert with others in volunteer service activities that strengthen the local community. So does anyone have any thoughts about this definition, the second definition? The obligation to actively participate. Does this sound a little like something you as Rotaractors are involved in, is what I want to know. Any thoughts on the second definition? I'd be interested to know, because the reason I pulled out this specific definition is because I thought it resonated the most with what it means to be part of a Rotaract club. You embrace these responsibilities. It is not an entitled duty, but it is an obligation, which means you're obliged to. You do it because you feel like you have the responsibility to do so. I'm not part of a Rotaract club, so I'd like it if someone could confirm that this is indeed something similar to what you do. And then the third one, which is my definition of what I see civic engagement to be, and it's a fairly simple definition because I like to keep things short, that is collective action for communal good. It is when people get together and they do something for the betterment of society. They do something for the greater good, right? So as you can see, there's no right or wrong answer. There are multiple definitions of what civic engagement is. Now, I thought that this illustration was actually it was quite on point, because as you can see, community coming together, civic engagement is about all of these aspects. You have education, you have consultations, communication, partnership, participation. All of this is what civic engagement embodies. It's about engaging, right? And this is also a nod to everyone today to please engage, because if you are to go out as young people, if you are going to go and engage, you have to be able to speak up, you have to communicate, you have to be a part of the discussion, right? So I thought that this illustration really sort of brings together what it means to be part of a civic society, to engage in civic participation. Right, I have a second question for you based on this slide. You might recognize the people in this slide, you might not, that's fine. How many of you recognize the politician in this slide? Can I have a show of hands, or a yes or a no? It's on the chat. Yep, that is Bernie Sanders. Anyone recognize the lady right above him? Cardi B. Right. Does anyone recognize the ladies over here? Yes, this is Cardi B, yes. But anyone recognize these ladies over here? Suffragettes, fantastic. Manishi, do you mind telling us who the suffragettes are, or what they did and / do?
They fought for women to get the vote, the ability to vote.
Fantastic. So this is what the suffragette movement was. They initially, in the first wave of feminism, they were fighting to get women's rights to vote, right? And this is how they did it. You know, they went out on the street, they had banners and posters, and, you know, they were engaged in protests. You know, they demanded that women be freed as political prisoners, you know, because back in the day when women went out to protests, they were often taken into prison, they were jailed, they were shunned from society. So the way that they continued to demand for the vote and continue to protest is by coming out onto the streets, right? And this is how they did it. This is how they contacted their political representatives. This is how they made an impression on society, right? Cardi B here with Bernie Sanders. And did anyone manage to catch this Instagram live? Was there anyone who watched this? Surprising. Nobody saw this Instagram live? Okay, that's fine. But what essentially happened here was Cardi B opened up her Instagram. She went on Instagram live and she was just, you know, talking about things. People knew that a special guest was going to come in, but people didn't know who that special guest was. And this was in the mid stages of the US election, right? And then all of a sudden, Bernie Sanders shows up on screen and they proceed to have a very cordial conversation together. And she talks about politics. She talks about what it means to be a Black woman. She talks about what his campaign means to her, and he answered most of her questions, right? So do you see any similarity between these two incidents? Is there anything that they have in common? Or if you don't think they have something in common, please do tell me.
What was the question?
So my question is, what do you think these two events have in common? Both talked about the women's rights, that's right. They're both advocating for similar purposes. Okay, anything else you see that's similar about what Cardi B is doing here and what the suffragettes are doing on the other side? You know, both Dinashi and Swari, I'm so sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, by the way. Your answers are correct, but is there any other similarity that you see?
They're not fighting for themselves, but they're fighting for a bigger cause.
Exactly. Okay. And Do you have a definition for that action? Do you think that's a specific term?
Yeah, civic participation.
Exactly, precisely. So what I'm trying to get to at here, thank you so much for answering, is that these are both instances of civic participation, right? And you can argue and say, oh, you know, Cardi B is a celebrity, she's a renowned rapper, you know, what does she know about politics? She has a bigger platform than perhaps the suffragettes on the other side. But at the end of the day, she is a voter. She is part of the voter base. And she's using her social media platform to reach out to amplify the voice of another politician and also act as a representative for thousands of followers who look up to her and have somewhat similar questions to what she has to ask, right? So what I want, and the reason that I brought this up as a visual is I want you to understand how far civic participation has come, from suffragettes, from women and men out on the streets, to people just having Instagram conversations with political representatives, right? So this is where social media has come into play in terms of civic participation, right? So traditionally, civic engagement or civic participation, as we like to call it, took place in the form of community meetings. You know, you would meet your political candidates, you'd call them, you'd go canvassing, which still happens today, and you'd attend protests, all of this, you know, signing petitions, writing articles to the newspaper, having widely publicized debates. Just out of curiosity, is there anyone here today who's done at least one of these things? Can I get a show of hands? Or a yes? Anyone who's engaged in this way? Okay, Ditni. Okay, there are three. Okay, fantastic. Okay, so we have 3 participants. Can those 3 participants let me know which area they've been involved in? You can send it on the chat, or you can just say it really quickly. Which of these have you been involved in? Okay, signing petitions. Okay, I did some, okay, signing petitions through the internet, fantastic. Petitions and articles, okay. Anyone else? Anyone gone for a community meeting here? Anyone gone for a protest? Okay, so a lot of signing petitions. Or were they physical petitions? I'm going to guess that they're online. Mostly online. Okay, Dibni, I'm curious to know what kind of articles you've written or helped with. Public debating, okay. Right, fantastic. So we have quite a range, right? And I think just judging by what I'm seeing here, a lot of this has happened online, which is fine, which is great, which is expected in this day and age. But as you can see, there are also other ways in which traditionally civic engagement happened. And if you've been to university, if you're at university, if you look back historically, universities were often spaces where civic engagement occurred among young people, because you would have political groups, political meetings between students and representatives, and it really was a hub of civic engagement back in the day. I'm not too sure how far that is today. I know that universities still continue to have a political aspect to it, but civic engagement was very face-to-face, is what I'm trying to say here. It really happened in person. However, today, young people's civic engagement is highly, if not completely, connected to the digital landscape. And the scope to participate in society online is what I'm really getting at. And I can see from your responses that this statement is in fact correct. Young people tend to connect online when they're participating in civic engagement, and it's becoming more and more common to do so. So we're basically seeing less people at community meetings, less people canvassing, fewer people attending protests. I don't want to say less, but fewer people attending protests, and mostly the engagement tends to be online, right? And what this is the scope to participate in an online society. So you take reality to the web, And that is where you base your participation. And this isn't surprising, because if you look at the data source of 2020, these are the number of users on a monthly basis and on a daily basis. So as you can see, there are millions of people using Twitter, WhatsApp, Facebook, and this is a reason why a lot of civic engagement and activity happens online. We have an increased number of users. So quite a startling amount of data, I thought this was, when you imagine that this many people use Facebook daily. I mean, that's quite something. Now, when it comes to civic spaces online, we've seen examples of this happening. For example, if you've been following the news and you've read about the Hong Kong protests, you'll understand that a majority of these protests took place on the streets, yes, but they were organized online through smartphones, through social media networks, through group chats, and they were coordinated through hashtags as well, so that people who were participating in the protests knew what to look for, knew where to get their information down, right? Interestingly enough, although all of this was happening, there were also a lot of social media shutdowns in the past few years. I'd say in the past 3 to 5 years, we've had an increased number of social media shutdowns. In 2018 alone, there were 128 documented internet shutdowns according to the Keep It On report. And that's quite a number. And it really begs the question, why do you suppose that so many social media / internet shutdowns were happening? We saw this happen in Sri Lanka as well. We've seen it happen several times before riots, in the aftermath of bombings. There have been shutdowns. And what I want you to understand from this is, when you curb mobilization of your online resources, right, it's often ineffective because people are going to find ways around it. People are going to find VPNs, they're going to find different chat and SMS services, but there's still an attempt for the digital space to be shut down. And the reason that is, and I want you to realize, it's because there's a lot of political and communal power in online spaces. And it's becoming more and more recognized as a medium to drive communal power, which is why it is both powerful and also at a great cost. So it's interesting to see that Sri Lanka was worth enough to have a social media shutdown. And that's important for you to understand as young people who use social media and the internet, to understand just how powerful this platform is. Now, let's turn towards Sri Lanka in terms of statistics. As of January 2020, we have 10.10 million internet users in the country. That's a massive increase between 2019 and 2020. I must say, with recent elections, with the recent presidential elections, with the coup, we've had a lot of people transferring from Facebook to Twitter, to Snapchat, just because there were so many social media shutdowns. So people were exploring new avenues to continue to stay online, to continue to get their information. So with that, there was a lot of migration from Facebook to other platforms. As of right now, there are 6.4 million social media users in Sri Lanka, and we have mobile connections in the millions, equivalent to 149% of the total population. So in case you're wondering how many people are online and have access to the internet on Sri Lanka, this is the scope that you are working with and potentially competing with. Now, I like to think that I was born into the internet generation. I think I was caught up in the beginning of the online generation, I like to think. But something that I have noticed is, as time goes on, social media, and I've mentioned this before, is evolving so quickly that you're never really on point at any given point. You're always a few steps behind it, struggling to keep up with it. And this is a platform that I was struggling to keep up with, which is TikTok. So how many people here have TikTok accounts? How many of you use or watch TikTok or secretly pretend to watch it but don't admit it? Because I know we have a percentage of people who do that as well, which is perfectly fine. But how many of you have TikTok accounts or actively use TikTok? I'm just curious to know, because I find it a fairly new it's fairly new to me. I'm not too savvy on TikTok. Okay, Manishi, do you have a TikTok account? Do you? Oh, fantastic. Okay, you should be doing this session then, this segment of the session, because I know very little about TikTok. Who else? Okay, Dinesh, you have, but you don't like to actively use it. That's fine. But I'm sure that if you've seen TikTok videos, if you've used TikTok, you notice that people are starting to share more and more serious information. And this is not to say that, dancing or sharing cooking videos or, creative videos aren't important. They're serious as well. But when I say serious, I mean, in a more political sort of civic engagement sort of way. And how I caught up how to vote on the international, not just on the American scale, but I've also seen a lot of upcoming Sri Lankan TikTok who talk about rights, who talk about areas that they're passionate about and that they advocate for. And it's a very new and vibrant sort of platform, because correct me if I'm wrong, one of you who use TikTok or who are familiar with TikTok, a single video is 15 seconds long, is that right? Yes, okay, fantastic. So you have 15 seconds to make an impression, to get your message across, and you already know this, with the social media age, we have a very, very short attention span. And because of that, this 15-second mark is perfect to get a swift message across and help retain it in our mind. So a very tactical social media platform that was essentially introduced as a video sharing platform, but has now become more of an informative sort of basis for young people. And it's very, very popular for political canvassing and just information sharing. And then you have the more traditional social media platforms for civic engagement, which is Instagram accounts like the Women and Media Collective. You have organizations like Hashtag Generation, for example, that share information, kind of amp up civic engagement online for young people. Groups that make it trendy, relevant, understanding, and kind of help young people come on board and understand rather serious and stressful political topics very, very easily. So this is where you see most online civic engagement taking place, right? Now, I'm going to pause this here, and based on what we've discussed so far, why do you as young people think that having advocacy, having civic engagement online, why do you think that it's better? Or why would you choose to be engaged in civic activities online? And this is a perfectly personal sort of question, so you can go ahead and just say it. Okay, Kulindu, you can approach more people. Okay, Swari, you can, okay, a larger number of people. Any other reasons as to why? Cheaper, faster. Okay, that is very, very true. It's much cheaper. You think it's much cheaper, but yes, it is cheaper at a surface level.
If you're not confident enough to do it physically, it gives you a lot of comfortable space to do it through online platform. Fantastic,
because you're essentially behind a screen. You feel safer because you're not physically out there, which is great. That's fine. And globally unite. Dinashi, you can engage through the internet from wherever you live around the world. Okay. Any other reasons? I'm smiling to myself because the responses that you're giving are very wholesome. If someone were to ask me why I use online, I just say it's because I'm lazy and it's just easier to do it online. But okay, right. It allows people to be creative. Exactly. There are more creative platforms. Okay. Fine. We'll stop it at that. But if you have any other insights, then please do share them. So most of you touched on exactly what I had included here, right? There's a wider scope to participate. You can be creative. And when I say it removes outdated interventions, I think because if you look at civic participation, sometimes it tends to be a bit structured. There's often a hierarchy. You want to sort of, you have to approach specific people, you have to give your ideas in writing, you have a very specific set of instructions and rules that you have to follow. But when you have things online, you don't have to go through that hierarchy. If you have something you want to say, you just say it, right? And you can often say it in a very creative way. You also have a bigger global audience and support system. Now, the reason I say support system is, let's take an individual in Sri Lanka. Let's take a young girl or a boy, or however you identify yourself as, from the LGBTQI community. An individual who feels like they are held back in our society, for example. And they hesitate to share their thoughts. They don't know if there's someone who can connect with them. But when you have a bigger global audience, chances are you are definitely going to meet people who are like-minded, right? And in that way, you have support systems. Even if they're not based where you're from, you find them from around the world, which is fantastic, which is how you make connections, how you network, right? The other point I think which is very important is it removes the need to approach institutions. Having civic communication, having civic activity online means that you can directly say what you have to do. You don't have to go through a screening process. You don't have to go to a government institution, sit in the waiting room, get a appointment to speak to someone. No, if you have an opinion, you can share it, right? And the other thing that I think is very, very important about online spaces is it definitely enhances minority voices, which is very, very important, which is something we've been seeing more often, and has become a very strong avenue for minorities who tend to be held back in the wider socio-political discourse, right? And the other thing, I think one of you mentioned this about, not feeling anxious and not having to physically face people. It's that the online spectrum often accounts for the differently abled, right? You will have people with different capacities. If you can't, if you're wheelchair bound, for example, you might find it difficult to sometimes come into a protest. If you have a speech impediment, if you have certain anxieties or like social anxieties, sometimes being involved online makes that much easier, because you can use text, you can use voice recognition, you can use illustrations to share your thoughts and ideas, right? So something that I want you to think about when you develop content for civic engagement moving onwards, just how inclusive online spaces can be for people who are stereotypically held back because of different abilities that they have. For the few of you who watch TikTok videos, I don't know if you've come across this, but I think I used to watch a few girls and some boys who had speech impediments. They had nervous tics, for example, so they couldn't really continue talking like this because they have nervous tics. And then there are also individuals from who can't see, who can't hear, who can't speak, who use ASL and sign language to kind of express their views and express how they tend to be discriminated in socio-political spheres and youth circles, right? And I thought that was very, very effective because TikTok, for example, allows you to put captions. So there was this young girl who had a speech impediment, who was signing her way through, but also had captions so that everyone could read and understand what she had to say. And I thought that was very, very powerful, because she was talking about how it was so difficult for her to register to be a voter because of this problem, because there were no people who understood ASL at the registration centers. So she was very open about this, and she spoke about just how difficult the process was. And this generated more discussion, more discourse, similar people got together, and that is where the civic engagement happened, in that specific circle. And I thought that was an incredible example of how you can use social media to engage with different people, right? And then the point that I quite enjoyed in your responses: quick, efficient, and inexpensive. Social media, unless you pay your bills at the end of the month, which you probably do, is fairly inexpensive. It's definitely a lot less expensive than having to organize massive political meetings. It's a lot less expensive than having to print material and slap them all across the walls in the city. No, it's cheap, it's efficient, and it's very, very quick. So this is why the online sphere is often very good for civic engagement. Right. Can anyone tell me why the online sphere is sometimes not better? Why do you think it's problematic? Why do you think, if you think, can it be a problem? Where are the shortcomings? It can be deceptive. Okay, Chanut, could you maybe elaborate a little bit on how you find it deceptive? Anyone else? Any other opinions on why social media can be problematic? Are we all massive fans of social media here?
No, since you're behind a screen, it's pretty easy to be like mean and do a lot of things that you wouldn't do in front of physical people.
Right, okay. So cyberbullying, essentially. The poor may not be able to participate, right? People must share and follow trends, so it might not be genuine, okay. Have you ever encountered any experiences where someone you followed turned out to be a hoax or a phony? Cost can be a prohibitive factor. Okay, that's true. It is very difficult to set up online spaces sometimes. Chanut, people can encounter false or misleading content. So essentially, I think what we're trying to say there is like fake news, doxing or scamming people. I do agree that online bullying is also a problem. Okay, right. So let's just see what I've mentioned here. So my problem with the online, we have one more. Cyber attacks. Okay, yeah, very true, very true. So my problem with the online sphere often not being enough is sometimes people tend to say, okay, so you're sharing a lot of political posts, you're sharing a lot of volunteering, avenues for volunteering. Is that enough? Does liking a status equal you physically going and voting, which is an act of civic engagement, right? Is posting a status the equivalent of volunteering in the community? And the other thing, confirmation bias, which I think you mentioned here. People must share and follow trends, so it might not be genuine. And this is part of the confirmation bias, because we tend to follow, we tend to look, listen, watch, learn, and pay attention to things that we like. So what happens is sometimes on social media, you tend to create like what you call tunnel vision, because you only see specific things that you want to see. And social media algorithms work in such a way, and that's a bit of a technical thing, so we won't deep dive into that, but algorithms will pay attention to what exactly you look, what exactly you purchase, what profiles you look at, and it will shape your home screen, your Twitter timeline to suit exactly what you want to see. So when that happens, you may not see an external person's opinion, or you may not want to see an external person's opinion, right? And then you have clicktivism, right? And I find this particularly problematic because Sri Lanka in particular has a culture of organizations, commercial organizations, for example, reaching out to impressionable young online personalities and getting them to do challenges or getting them to promote things and promote ideologies. And they do it not because they genuinely care about what they're promoting, but because it generates likes, because it generates an income, right? So this can be very, very strategic. And the problem is you may not realize this because you may follow that person not understanding the underlying reason for their activism, not understanding the underlying reason for what they're trying to portray. And I think this brings on another point that was talked on, and that is, because people are behind a screen, you can never be 100% sure who this person is, why they're sharing what they're doing, and what the end result will be, right? And I think, and this is something that I had a conversation with a fairly older political representative about. She's in her late 50s, early 60s. What she considers social media problematic is because she's like, okay, it's great, like all this awareness, all this conversation, but where is the action? Where are actual things happening? Where is the change happening, right? So as you can see, while the online sphere brings a lot of nuance, it brings a lot of creativity, it opens up so many avenues for civic engagement, it isn't without its problems, right? And I think what I want you to start thinking about is, how do we mitigate this, right? Just a show of hands, you don't have to switch your mics on. How many of you, and please be honest to yourself, because we're trying to learn here, right? And we've all made these mistakes. How many of you just share a random headline that you see on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram just because a particularly vocal person has been talking about it? How many of you have just, done that? Like you're scrolling through. Okay, thank you for your honesty. I've done it too. How many else tend to kind of sort of do that? Okay, good. I mean, that's fine. I'm sure more than 2 people here have done it. Okay, Dinashi, okay. We have 3 people, 4. Okay. What I'm trying to say here is it's very easy to do that, right? It's very, very easy to just be scrolling down your timeline. You have a friend or a friend of a friend that you're following who is very politically savvy, who does a lot of volunteering work, who's very actively involved, is very civically engaged, and they share something that has a very, and I'm not even talking about fake news here. I'm just saying that they share something and it looks impressive, and you want to be a part of it, so you know what, you just share it, right? And then when you go back and you read that article, when you have some free time, you realize that it has no value addition. It was just a very interesting headline and a very engaging picture or something that went with it, right? So we've all done it. And I want you to be more self-aware of this, because it's a learning process. And this is where I come back to what I said in the very beginning. Social media is still very new to us. We're still trying to understand it. We're still trying to catch up and keep up with it. So it's very, very important that as young people who are going to be engaged online and you're going to carry out civic activities online, that you are a bit more self-reflective in how you approach these things, right? Because we're talking about social media, I thought this meme was fairly relevant. Does it make an impact? Do these things really make an impact? Thenumi, terrorism and many other negative ideas can be shared on social media for disadvantages. Yes, exactly. And I will get to this. I will get to this at the end of the discussion, because this is a fairly deep topic. And we will touch upon it at the end of the discussion, because it's still very important, right? So, just because you pushed your political views on Facebook doesn't really mean that it's going to change anyone's perception. Do you think this is true? Do you think this particular meme speaks the truth? Nope. Okay, Dinashi. It does make people aware, but I can't say it has a very big impact on people. Okay, that's interesting. So that's just something for you to think about as potential social media engagers. This is something that I want you to think about. Does it really make an impact? If it doesn't make an impact, as you say, why is social media such a big component in political communications? Anyone recognize this game? Is this familiar to anybody? Have you played it? Okay. Okay. Right. Fine. Anyone recognize the player? Nope, it's not Kamala. Yep, that's right, Alexandra. It's AOC, right? And recently she went live on Twitch, I believe, which is a streaming platform. And she played Among Us with a bunch of other, fairly popular Twitch streamers. And you question why, because obviously there's a motive to this. She's not going to spend a couple of hours every day playing Among Us. This is how they engage with young people. This is how you get young people interested in political and civil spaces, right? And I mean, we all recognize this gentleman here, who I personally consider was revolutionary when it came to political communications, because no one handled/mishandled political communications as much as Donald Trump has. He really started a revolution with his usage of Twitter. And you can like the guy, you can hate the guy. At the end of the day, he was very, very effective in using social media for civic engagement. I'm sure most of you have seen, the MAGA hashtags, the Twitter posts, the Facebook live streams. This is how he generated civic engagement within his electorate, right? This is how he got his voters to speak, to share information, to, kind of influence people, right? So the truth is, at the end of the day, despite the many flaws that social media has and will continue to have, political communications considers it an important aspect. And because of that, it is very important for civic spaces as well. So I want you to think about that just a little bit, because I know we think that social media is cheap. I know we think it's more effective and cost effective in terms of other campaigns, but there's a lot of thought and input that goes into these, right? Political leaders are not going to wake up one morning and decide that they're going to play Among Us with a few Twitch streamers. There's a thought process that goes behind it. There isn't a thought process that goes behind Trump, but that's a different conversation to have. Okay, so we have been looking at quite a few examples, mostly from an American basis. We had the example of the social media shutdown in Sri Lanka in 2019, I believe, just after the Easter bombings. And now I want to focus on an ongoing case study that I have been observing and taking notes on and doing some research on, an example of civic engagement that was generated online, right? How many of you have heard of the hashtag Stopped Forced Cremations movement? Let's call it that. How many of you have heard of this or seen it? Okay, can one of you just explain to all of us here today what this is about?
It's about how a little girl was cremated when the family didn't want her to be cremated, and it's all about that and how it should be done.
Okay, right. Thank you. So essentially, with COVID-19 and with the unfortunate death of so many people, Sri Lanka is currently facing an issue where cremations are being forced on people of different religious backgrounds and religious entities, and it's just not part of their theological and cultural habits to cremate someone who has passed away. And the fact that these forced cremations are happening is causing quite a bit of stir within the population, right? So recently, as an act of solidarity, as a symbolic representation of how we as a community, regardless of our religion, completely criticize this and are not okay with this. As you can see, a few people went to the cemetery, the Barala Cemetery, and they tied white strips of cloth in solidarity with the young child who had passed away. So as you can see here, this is what I've taken from Twitter on the 13th of December. And this is the instructions that were shared. So this particular picture is also shared on Instagram, if I remember correctly. And you had the hashtag, you have the text as required. and you have all the hashtags here as well. And then this is how this particular post was reshared in a more simpler format, right? So that's how the engagement took place. But as you may already know, these white cloths were taken away. A few days afterwards, they were removed. However, that didn't stop the action from continuing all across the country, right? So although the white cloths were taken away from the Borella cemetery where this originated, as you can see, it created a domino effect, a chain of events that led to this particular movement, this awareness, traveling across the country. So you have people from all over Sri Lanka who were tying white strips of cloth to their gates, to cemeteries in the area, and there was a call for respect towards minority rights and the rights of the dead, right? So you can see how it started on the 13th of December, a little bit before that, if I remember correctly. And then even though the cloth was removed by then on the 14th of December, within a day, essentially, this had traveled across the country, right? So let's review this. What has this example of online civic engagement done, right? And I want you to give me your input. Do you think that this has created awareness?
Yes, but it didn't really get to everyone.
Okay, good question. Okay, so Ditni has a thumbs up here. I can see. Anyone else? No? Okay. Do we agree that this has encouraged public action? Does everyone agree on that? I see a thumbs up. Do you think this spread the message adequately enough? Okay, Ajmal, okay, I see you. Depends. Okay, Ditni, would you like to elaborate on why you think that depends?
It depends on the magnitude of the awareness created. Like if it's somebody really popular,
okay,
I mean, it would work. But if it was somebody like me who's still a minor and isn't taken very seriously at this age, it wouldn't really. I mean, it would, but it wouldn't be as great of a magnitude if it was done by a popular person.
Okay, all right, sure. Okay, do we think this generated a response? All of this, do you think it generated a good enough response? Not really. Manishi, would you? Okay, so we have, this is fantastic. We have two opposing spectrums. Manishi, would you like to tell us why you think it didn't really generate a good enough response? And then we'll hear from Swairi.
Because forced cremations, they've been put on hold, but the government hasn't really decided against them yet. So it hasn't really had the impact that they wanted the campaign to have.
Okay, right. Okay. And Swairi, why do you think that it has made quite an impact?
Yeah, it has made quite an impact, but not a very large impact. I mean, people did go out there and tie those ribbons, but it didn't get to everyone.
Okay, right. And when you say it didn't get to everyone, who do you mean by that? Who is this hypothetical everyone that you're referring to?
People who don't use social media because of the social media divide.
Okay.
The information.
Okay, right. That's interesting. So, I mean, you're both right. Essentially, you're both right. You're not wrong. But let's also keep in mind that this is still ongoing. And I know that there have been quite a few internationally published articles about this, where people have kind of picked up on what's happening and picked up on the fact that, activists, and not even just activists, but people like you and me have gone and, essentially tied white cloths in protest, right? And the question really lies as to, has this made an impact? Now, I do believe that a little while after all of this happened, the Prime Minister did have a meeting with a few government officials, and they did discuss this. So whether this was directly connected or impacted by this is questionable. We don't know. But it did happen after this civic movement took place. However, we see that the issue of forced cremations is still going on, right? I'd like to ask you now, if your opinion on social media as a space for civic engagement, has it changed? Has this changed how you feel about social media as a vehicle for civic engagement? Because I think it's important that we don't just take something because everyone says it's fantastic and then just sort of accept that. I think it's important that we break it down and sort of see where and how it is impactful. So any thoughts on that? Okay, Miru, what do you mean by not really? Do you think it has it, does this mean that this hasn't changed your opinion on social media as a civic space? Or, okay, so you still think it's worthwhile? Okay, limited, right? It's made me see that simply social media, okay, fantastic. That is exactly what I wanted to get to. Okay, you have to back it up with effective action. Anyone else? Is there anyone who thinks this entire thing was successful? That this hashtag, this engagement? Because let's not forget, there is physical action happening here, offline, where people get together and they kind of come together as a community for this cause. So it's not entirely online, sorry, there is an offline component. Anyone who thinks this was actually successful and it really touched them deeply and made you think? Okay, Manishi, great, fantastic. So I'm just going to leave this there for you to think about. I hope this kind of rests in your mind and starts generating some thoughts. And I'll move on to another aspect, which was a status I saw a few hours ago. A friend who had sort of mentioned how badly social distancing is happening at the cancer hospital, at the cancer hospital in Sri Lanka, the Apeksha Cancer Hospital. And she'd written her experience on why and how this was happening. And as you can see, she's tagged the relevant parties to maybe look into it, right? And this is, again, using the online space for information sharing, for making people more aware, for getting communities sort of involved, right? And I thought this was fairly interesting because it's incredible how often you see things like this happening, because more and more people tend to put these updates online, right? And the purpose of this update is not to complain. It's not necessarily to say, oh, look, I was here, I saw this, I'm going to create a ruckus about it. No, this generates civic engagement, right? This is something that an individual is doing, using a platform as their voice to share information, to make people more aware, to create a conversation, which, if you think about it, is what social media civic engagement is about, right? And then you also have platforms like GoFundMe, where you see people, maybe not so much in Sri Lanka, but I think globally, if you look at it, GoFundMe tends to be an organization where, again, you can engage with different communities, collect money, and you can do all of these things online. So it's very interesting how all these different platforms are being used. Now, this, for example, was on Twitter and Instagram, and then you had this on Facebook and this on a completely different platform, right? Great. So now we come to obstacles and shortcomings, right? And I think most of you mentioned this in the beginning of the discussion. The reason that social media and civic participation can sometimes be a problem is because we do have a divide in terms of digital skills and technology, right? It is expensive to own a smartphone. It's expensive to own a laptop. I mean, we've seen this already because of COVID-19 shutdowns. A lot of people in rural communities, they don't have access to the internet. They don't have smartphones. They don't have laptops. They can't do their studies, even though we're required to in this current day and age, right? And we've seen plenty of insight as to how that's happened. So it's very clear that Sri Lanka has a huge technological divide, right? And then subpar civic education. I remember when I was in school, we didn't really have civic education skills. We didn't really have political science until we came to A levels. And when you have that it's very difficult for students to start thinking critically about anything, because something I've noticed from where we come from is that you're generally spoon-fed to believe a certain thing. You just accept it. You don't critically think about it or analyze it, or you don't find fault in it just because you don't think it's the right thing to do. The other thing is a lack of physical space for activism, as many of you mentioned before. It's not enough to just do things online. Sometimes you have to go out there, and in order to go out there, you have to feel safe. You have to have the space to do so, and sometimes you might not really get that. Lack of trust, again, I think this was mentioned by all of you before we reached here, and that was, you just don't know who the person on the other side of the screen is, which makes the whole process very complicated. Cyberbullying, and some of the major things such as data and privacy issues, because as you know, massive organizations are just mining data and we don't even realize it, right? And this could be a problem for people moving forward, because it could jeopardize your work, it could jeopardize your safety, your security, the safety of your loved ones, right? And the other thing which I personally find a bit amusing is the generational difference and the problems that come with that, because I'm forever telling my mother not to forward things on WhatsApp or to believe every free airline ticket offer she gets on Facebook. So there's a huge generational difference, and we need to start thinking about whether or not that can be an obstacle for us when we're engaging online, right? Because how do we get people who hardly use a smartphone to come and be part of a digital campaign? How do we make sure they understand what they're seeing on the screen? Do we know if they can read? Do we know if they can understand how to use a touch phone? Do your parents know what a hashtag actually does? Do they want to know what a hashtag actually does, right? So in that sense, we have to be more creative in how we engage the different generations, right? Does anyone else want to add any obstacles or shortcomings that you think you see online, working on social media? Does anyone have anything different to add here? I think this fairly covers it, but if there's anything that you think I've missed, please do share. And you can just send it on the chat. I'm just going to move on. I'm just mindful of time. Okay, so 2 questions for you. And I really want you to answer this as best as possible. How many of you have been part of anything online based, civic engagement wise? Anything that happened online? And this is your chance to really show off if you have, because I'd really like to hear. Okay, interesting, because, and the reason that I'm asking this is I think that sometimes we don't realize we're participating in civic activities online, even though we are, because we've gotten so used to the online, working online, that we don't realize it. And I say this because what we're currently doing right now, having this discussion, having this conversation, learning about online civic participation is actually an example of engaging, because this is what people did before you had social media. You got together as a group, you sat down, you had conversations, you taught people about how to protest, what to do when you protest, what to write on your banners and boards that you're collecting, right? This is an example of a space where we are engaging because we want to learn, because we want to be more self-aware, because we want to do something for the betterment of our communities, right? So congratulations, essentially we're all participating in civic activity here, because our intentions and hopefully our actions after we leave this session will be posed towards the betterment of society, right? Given that most of us have been at home for the past few months because of COVID, I'd like you to, and this please, I'd really like you to send in a chat message or at least speak about this. Do you think that because of COVID, people will engage more online? And this, I really do want to know what you think about this. Anyone who thinks that, thank you, by the way, anyone who thinks that it's not going to be that way, that we'll all go back to just engaging. Okay, so, okay, right. Anyone who thinks otherwise, who thinks that things will just go back to normal and we won't have to worry about the online space too much. I'm sorry if you can hear my dog barking, by the way. I do apologize. Much more online engagement, okay. Nipun, you've seen a rapid increase, okay. Would you like to tell me how you've seen an increase? Like in what way have you seen an increase? Are more people online, or are more people engaging or posting online? How have you seen the increase? And the reason I ask that is because I've seen a lot of my friends decrease their online activity because they're constantly online because of work. So I feel like no one really checks Instagram or Twitter as often as they used to because they're already online for work purposes. So Nipun, I'd really like it if you could just let me know how you've seen and where you've seen this rapid increase. Okay, okay, right. That's interesting because people are in their houses. Interestingly enough, I genuinely feel, and please, you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like a lot of the older generation is online now. I feel like, mums and dads and like aunts and uncles tend to be on their phones more often because they're at home, just as much as we are, which is interesting because this might create a new dynamic of online users. Because I think I spoke to a friend recently and she said her mom downloaded TikTok, but she has no idea what to do with it. So, that's interesting. Okay, so that's something for you to think about. In the post-COVID world, how effective will digital spaces be? Thanks, guys. And now, ways to improve. Right. So let's double back, shall we? You are all here today as young civic leaders, as members of a Rotaract club, who are essentially going to go on and do great things for your friends, for your community, for your people, and indirectly for your country. And you will have to engage online. You will have to use online spaces, right? And if you've noticed, the structure of this presentation today wasn't simply me telling you, yes, go on, go use online spaces, take everything, make everything digital, do your social media campaigns, do your hashtags. No. The reason that I didn't follow this way is because these spaces are very, very unique and they're also very fast paced. So a lot of the things we do, we have to be very, very tactical about, right? And the next time you go online and you see someone advocating for something or sharing something or asking you to be a part of something, I want you to be very, very careful and critical in the way you approach it, right? Why is this particular person sharing this with me? Why are they sharing it with everyone else, right? Is my expertise really needed? Am I being asked to do this because I'm a value addition or because they just want to generate conversation, right? And this is where you need to be wary of the commercialized aspect of online content, right? And this is also an area where lots of criticism comes for civic engagement online because people can be paid to say specific things. Organizations can fund or sponsor. I mean, you've seen social media influencers being sponsored to talk about the same plate of pasta 5 different times in 5 different ways, right? And then when you finally go and you get it, you realize that it's terrible. Similarly, civic engagement can happen like that as well, right? There can be a commercialized aspect to it. Interestingly enough, so far in Sri Lanka, I haven't seen a knowingly commercialized sort of civic dialogue going on, but you never really know. So it's very, very important to understand what you're seeing and look at it in a very analytical way, right? I've mentioned the third one in capitals because it's very important: security. We share so much online that we tend to forget that we're leaving hints and clues that can compromise our safety, right? If you're constantly sharing where you're going or what you're doing or who you're doing it with, it'll help people link the pieces together, right? And sort of figure out who you are. And this can have a disastrous impact on your safety. So be very, very careful when you're online. I'm not just saying the regular, don't share your credit card details or your address. It's not just that, right? Don't share where you constantly are. If you have an ID on you, make sure it's not visible when you're sharing selfies or videos online, right? And also be mindful of the fact that your data is being used. And when I say this, I mean what you're using and the sites that you're visiting and that sort of thing. So be wary of security. The other aspect is be mindful and open to criticism and change. Understand that not everyone sees social media the same way you do. Not everyone is as passionate about causes as you are, right? You could be very, very passionate about, women empowerment or climate change, but you'll also meet people who don't share the same empathy, who don't share the same excitement for what you're passionate about. And that's perfectly fine. You don't want to be in an echo chamber of, I will get to terrorism at the end of this. Thanks, Tenumi. You need to be mindful of criticism and change, because that's how you develop your messaging. That's how you develop your approach to social media content, right? The other thing, and this is, I think, the most important thing, is social media has its faults, but so does everything else, right? Nothing is impenetrable, nothing is perfect. So when you are engaging online, when you are participating in civic activities online, understand that social media is just a means to an end. It's not an end. It is a vessel. It is not the final destination. So you use social media as a vessel to generate ideas, create media, to share your ideas, right? But you also have to ensure that there's activity that happens at the end of that. You have to make sure that there is action that is generated by what you're doing on social media, right? So treat social media as a vessel. Just because you posted 3 statuses about the current state of affairs in Sri Lanka doesn't mean that the country is going to change, right? You have to target the way that you share your information. You have to make sure it reaches the right parties. And this is where the offline element happens, right? So remember that social media is a vessel. And because we're tracking the impact of this vessel, make sure you take a look at what impacts happen both offline and online. You get 100 likes on a picture, fantastic. Do 100 people outside your social circle know about what you're doing? No, then there's really no point, right? Social media does a lot to make you feel important. It does a lot to create self-importance, You're like, my post got this many likes, this many shares, fantastic, I feel great about it, it's a good day. But has it made a difference? Has it made an impact? So when you're doing your projects, when you're doing work for the community, make sure you have someone or a team that monitors the impact of what you do online and how it impacts you offline, right? I'm going to come to the point that, Tenumi made on terrorism. And this is, it's not entirely related to social media, but it is an aspect that I think is very important. So I did my thesis on terrorism, coincidentally, but I won't go on about that. But my focus was on how the media highlighted terrorism, right? And terrorism in itself is a very, very difficult word. Believe it or not, there is no direct definition for terrorism. Terrorism is portrayed in many ways. It appears in many ways. Sometimes it's validated, sometimes it isn't. The way that we structure and shape our definition of terrorism creates a lot of biases in communities. We begin to question if things that happened during colonialism were actually acts of terror. Were they? If you were looking at some of the objectives and the wars and the conflicts that happened before the modern times, you'd question, was that colonialism or was that terrorism? So it's an inevitable Pandora's box of problems, and we're still trying to piece our way through it, right? But terrorism online is a very real thing. And the online sphere has been used to share ideas of extremism and terror and sort of create a divide between people and alienate them. So this is also an aspect that I'm not saying that you're going to engage with a terrorist the moment you have some kind of social media campaign. That's not what I mean. But it is something to be aware of, because the online space is so vast, it's so diverse. You never know how people are using it and what they're using for, right? Again, which is why you need to treat social media as a means to an end and not as a definite, right? This, I think, which applies to everything we see online. I thought this was very apt. Don't believe everything you read on the internet just because there's a picture with a quote next to it, which makes a lot of sense, because in this day and age, people are very creative. They're very extravagant and out there with their advertising and their social media posting, and they tend to conflate things quite a bit. So it's very important that you have that analytical mindset when you approach these things and really think to yourself, is this substantial? Is this worthwhile? With that, I come to the end of the presentation. I'm just 6 minutes over time, so I do apologize to the organizing team. Only 6 minutes. But you don't simply do civic engagement. There's a lot more that goes to it, online and offline. And I hope that more than anything, this discussion made you think about how you can engage online in a more critical sense, and not just as somebody who's active on social media, because civic engagement requires results. It is not a dead end. It is not simply a statement or a powerful tweet. It is generating a response. It is generating a reaction, and it's creating action. So you need to remember that, yes, what you do online is good, is important. It's an incredible space to bring people together. But are you doing it for the right reasons? Are you doing it well enough? And how can you do it in such a way that your online advocacy, your online activities create a domino effect, and at the end of the day, do good for communities? Because that's why we're here. That's why we're having this conversation. This is why we're engaged in academics or our work, because we want to make positive change at the end of the day.